All right, all you, Alex.
All right. Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your Saturday to engage with this. I'm really excited to share more information about Incite-Insight and general practices of recording and analyzing your own work as a practitioner in theater and education. So in a moment, and by moment I mean right now, I'm going to open up this presentation fully. And I just want to make sure everyone can see this. So if anyone is having difficulty seeing this slide, please make that known now. All right, we're going to move on then. Here we go. So this is how to document and write about your process for Incite-Insight. Before we get started, just some housekeeping for this webinar. I'm going to request that everyone please mute your microphones, just so we don't have any excess noise or background noise, and that doesn't lead to the conference. Also, sometimes, too, weird audio things can happen. We can get an echo chamber or what have you. So if you wouldn't mind muting your microphone, that would be appreciated. Also, I ask that you please save questions for the end and ask them via written chat. We might have time as well to open up the microphones again. But like I mentioned just now, sometimes technology can be really funky, particularly when it comes to microphones in these sorts of webinars. So we want to try to keep things as coordinated and to avoid as much chaos as possible. Also, at any point, if there is a glitch or if I'm moving too quickly, feel free to shoot me a message. I've had a lot of coffee this morning, so I might sort of zip through this. So please tell me to slow down. You can write in the chat feature. I should get an audio notification when you submit something in the chat, but if I don't see it, Alexis might give me a heads up that someone is sending in a message. Okay? So let's move forward. Oh, one other thing. This webinar is being recorded, so I just want everyone to know that. We're hoping to send this out to the folks who have registered but weren't able to make it. So here's a quote that I wanted to open with, and I've always found this to be quite compelling. This is from Spalding Gray, the famous solo performer with the Worcester Group. I couldn't spell, I couldn't write, I could barely read. I didn't know that had nothing to do with writing. And I find that to be a very interesting thought to open with. It's important for Incite-Insight, but I believe also for any publication, particularly one that reflects practice of a theater educator, to know that you don't have to be a proficient or expert writer to engage in the writing practice. I think sometimes writing communities or writing circles or publications can be rather snooty and elitist about certain protocols for how one can engage and share their work. Writing is a contemplative and a deliberate expression of your experience, and that is not confined by any rules or prerequisites, in my personal opinion. Now, that being said, of course, we're going to go through different structures and tips to help facilitate that contemplation and that deliberate expression. And further, Incite-Insight does have some structures to help make sure that these expressions are clear to our audience. But I want to emphasize, despite the fact that we're going to be going to some very specific tips, I do not think, and I think any editor or writer who is legitimately about this craft thinks that this is something to be snooty about, or at least I hope not. That's not how I work. So who am I? How can I make such a claim? So another way of asking this question is, why am I qualified to be giving this webinar? Well, first off, I'm a member of the AATE board, and I've been really proud to serve with the board these past few years. But I'm also the editor of Incite-Insight, as you probably know. I'm also a writer at Backstage Magazine, and I've contributed writing to a few other publications, including American Theater, HowlRound, and Scalawag. I have a forthcoming chapter about theater pedagogy in the South, and the South is sort of my jam. Right now, I'm a visiting artist at Agnes Scott College in Atlanta, and I spent 4 years as an elementary school theater teacher in the classroom in New Orleans. And another thing that might be good to know is I have no hobbies. I make theater with students, and I write about it. That's really all I do. So I hope that I can provide some sort of expertise or perspective when it comes to those two subjects. So let's talk about this phrase, reflective practice, and unpack it a little bit. So why do we engage in reflective practice? So it expands our understanding of certain topics and helps us think through our pedagogical approaches. Indeed, when you write about something and have to articulate your experience, you're forced to think about it and assess it in a new way. Such reflective practice also documents your work in concrete ways that can be shared with administrators, community stakeholders, or even included in grant applications for folks who intersect with the nonprofit world, or, of course, even in education as well, particularly in the public setting. That can be incredibly valuable. And additionally, in a publishing-centric academic landscape, it can help bolster your CV. And being published and having a writing canon can lead to promotion, tenure, or added legitimacy within your academic institution. So it's also important to say, but besides all those points, so this can be used to articulate what you do. This can be used to engage with folks. It can be used in grant applications. But that's one component. But the other is the fact that reflective practice is also a habit of the trade. And as we all probably know, practitioners of quality reflect and assess their approach regularly. You never want to get stuck into a certain track. You want to be flexible and expand. So reflective practice helps facilitate that, in my opinion. Now, how does Incite-Insight play a role in habits of reflective practice? So let's start with talking about Incite-Insight's origins really quickly. So it started as an ad-funded publication, and this was around 2009 or so that it was assembled like a magazine, you can see here. And there was a little bit of a hiatus, and it was revived in 2018 by Erica Atkins along with Carolyn Marie Wright and Anna Smith. It maintained this magazine layout and design. However, it was online. But there were some challenges in maintaining this presence. So it's an all-volunteer editorial board. There's inherent turnover given the nature of a term-structured organization. And Incite-Insight was using a volunteer designer, and access to designers would be variable, which would obviously be an issue from edition to edition, I should say. And finally, errors and typos are inevitable. Even the Washington Post and the New York Times, as you probably know, has issues when it comes to grammar and punctuation. It's just the nature of the game. And we couldn't easily rectify or fix these typos or errors because it was on a quarterly system and because it was being treated as a print publication. So at the beginning of this year, 2020, we've transferred to Facebook. And this was it could be seen as, I don't know, controversial might be too spicy a word, but some people definitely were scratching their heads, particularly given all of the ways that Facebook is really being challenged, criticized, and reassessed in our society. But it was necessary, and let me tell you why. So we moved here to Facebook, and we have a Facebook page now. And what it does is it allows us to publish articles as notes. This is really helpful for a few reasons. The first is that it gives it a nice, clean look, and it's easy to input writing. Also, it provides helpful things like estimates on how long it would take a reader to move through the article. It allows for comments, which we just didn't have that dialogue capability when we were treating as a print publication, even when we put it online. We have analytics, so we can see what's going on, and we can see how people engage with different articles. And a few other things. It allows for easy upload and editing of writing. We can transfer between different classes of editors when my service is done on the board, or as an editor of Incite-Insight can easily transfer to a new person. Easy sharing and commenting functions, as I indicated earlier, analytics. And also it's free. Look, AATE is an organization. It's a nonprofit servicing two traditionally underfunded fields. And AATE has made a commitment to prioritizing its budget in ways that will benefit programming. And so now Incite-Insight is not a line item on the budget. And further, this platform reduces the need and necessity for Incite-Insight editors and AATE board members to solicit ads. Finally, and I think this is the most exciting, is that in a way this sort of democratizes the writing that Incite-Insight publishes. It's a new platform and allows for access to Incite-Insight despite AATE membership. And hopefully this will increase readership and awareness of AATE. One other thing that should be noted is that if you get published on Incite-Insight, the readers do not need a Facebook account to read it. It is public, and folks can log in, or they can see your work rather without having to log in. If you log in, of course, you get additional capabilities like commenting and sharing. but the work is accessible to anyone. So now I'd like to talk about the structure of Incite-Insight. Who's exactly involved in this? Well, we have a new structure with this new platform. So now we have a publisher, and so this is the communications chair of the AATE board. Currently, I'm serving in that role. Additionally, there's an editor, or this could be seen as an editor-in-chief, a person who is volunteering on a yearly term and is overseeing the whole movement of the publication, or the resource might be a better term for it, considering now we're in this online platform. We have a copy editor. This is a volunteer who edits for grammar, style, and punctuation. And then we have an associate editor, volunteer who solicits and communicates with writers. I want to make a plug as well. If any of these positions are of interest to you, at the end of this presentation, I will offer my email address, and I would encourage you to reach out and let me know if you want to volunteer service as an editor in any way. This is a good way to not only serve the field, but to enhance your own craft as a practitioner and writer as well. Now, I'd like to spend some time talking about the editing chain. When you submit to Incite-Insight, what happens next? So a writer pitches an idea to an editor, or in some cases, an editor might solicit the writer. And the writer will submit a draft of the article or essay. And with Incite-Insight, we decide to use Google Docs. And this will go into the first phase of editing. Within that first phase, the editor will send a draft to the writer, and it is now a working document. So within Google Docs, what's really great is that editors can easily input comments or highlight certain sections, what have you. So the editor will respond to the work and then notify the writer that there are comments within the Google Doc. And the writer can either accept or respond to those editor note. If there's a question about a note or something doesn't make sense, there can be a dialogue within Google Docs about that. From there, once those initial edits are accepted or talked about, then that will go to the copy editor. And then the article is approved by the editor or editor-in-chief, and then that will be scheduled for circulation online. Now, I want to take a moment just to dig into why Google Docs. Well, this gives you a little glimpse of what I was talking about just now. So as you can see, we can comment and open up a dialogue about specific things. And once a piece enters the editing phase, it then becomes a working document. And we find that Google Docs just helps facilitate that. We can have multiple people editing, which work at the same time, which works for us because we work as a team. And while you can get these same functions in Microsoft Word, for example, it can get a little tricky transferring the file and keeping up to date with what file is the most accurate. We find that just by having one Google Doc where all the changes happens helps keep our volunteer editorial staff on track and avoids any redundancies. Now, let's talk about different types of contributions and reflective practice that Incite-Insight publishes and is interested in. And we specified these different categories to help the process of the writer and to help train the reader to understand how to interpret these items of reflective practice. So the first category that one submission to Incite-Insight can fall under is a case study. A case study, as you probably know, is a reflection on an episode or a circumstance in a professional working environment where the intersection of theater and education is relevant, and it could be an episode that another practitioner might encounter. So we try to encourage this structure for case studies, generally speaking. We want the case studies to be shorter, around 400 words. We also encourage you not to name an institution. Subject names obviously should be given generic variables. So this means like student A or teacher B. A relevant educational setting should be identified. So what grade or what age range does this relate to? All subjects we encourage should be classified with a gender-neutral pronoun, unless gender is essential to the subject of the case. Let me give you a quick example. I wrote a case study last year about a situation I had with a student who transitioned their gender in the process of a production. In that case study, their gender pronoun was essential to identify. So that's obviously a special circumstance. All essential factors which could inform decision-making in the case should be listed. So that includes maybe when this episode would fall in the academic year, if there are other conditions that might be relevant to other practitioners understanding the conundrum of the case. And studies should be straightforward and clear, and always written in the present tense. Case studies are intended to provoke a dialogue about best practices, and scenarios should be constructed to engage feedback. So one case study that I use in my classes when I work with people who are training to be theater educators is one about social media in the dressing room. The idea of constructing such a case study is to get the students thinking about many different options and responses that you might not learn in a theater education program or might not be out of a book, but something unique that only someone in the field might have to experience. So that's the case study structure. The second category that you can submit to Incite-Insight is a reflection. This is probably the most common. A written reflection is looking at a meaningful moment of engagement within theater and education. We try to encourage these to be 1,500 words in length, and we encourage this structure for reflections. An introduction, and so the notion of this is to introduce the reader to you and your practice, your field, your context, okay? The second section is a method. So this is when you inform the readers of how you have assembled and opined the insights you aim to share. And the third section are the insights themselves. So you share with the readers these specific insights from your own personal experience, things that you have gleaned in the classroom with your practice. And with key concepts, we encourage you to actually highlight those concepts and put them in bold so they stick out to the reader. As you're scanning through an article, you can see exactly, you can identify very easily what your key concept is and what is the most essential component of your insight. And we encourage you to bold no more than 3 key concepts. So be very deliberate about what are the big contributions to the field that you want to identify. We're going to talk a little bit more too about how to determine what those key concepts should be. And then the fourth section is the conclusion. So this is a reiteration or an underlining of essential truths or wisdoms that you attempt to offer to the field vis-a-vis your own personal experience. Oh, one other part of the conclusion. Identify next steps for your practice. So now that you've determined or identified these essential things that you wish to share with the field at large, where do you plan to go from here? I think it's important that pieces that are contributed are in flux, in movement, and are ascending. So where do you go next? The next section that can be contributed to Incite-Insight is a lesson plan. This is another category. And we know what a lesson plan is, a procedure of instruction for theater and education. But we do have a preferred structure because, as we all know, lesson plans in their design can be incredibly diverse. Dependent on the school district you work in or sometimes the institution itself, lesson plans can look drastically different. So we try to create a uniform structure for our readers. And this is the structure. So we encourage you to name your lesson plan to help hook the reader. Obviously, the age range of intended participants would be helpful. And some exercises can be multi-generational, absolutely. You just want to make sure that you identify that if so. We ask you to estimate the total time needed. Is this a lesson that needs to span over 4 one-hour classes, or is this something you can do in 30 minutes? What are the materials? What's the purpose of the exercise or the lesson? And this can be framed as students will warm up their bodies, students will explore this character, etc. We also ask you to come up with a warm-up specifically for that lesson that's relevant. How do you transition the students from whatever they were doing before into your lesson? And then this is the perhaps the most essential part of submitting a lesson plan to Incite-Insight is we ask for numbered instructions. Step 1, Step 2, Step 3. From there, after you've outlined the ingredients or the cookbook of your lesson, we encourage you to also provide variations. How can people adjust the tracks of the lesson dependent on student responses? We also would really appreciate the writers articulating a cool down or a warm down for the lesson. In the same way that it's important to identify how to transition the students into the lesson, how do you transition the students out of the lesson and reiterate key themes? And then what are the next steps? What would be the next steps in the progression? The last thing that is very important, and oftentimes people, I think, unintentionally exclude this, is making sure that you cite and acknowledge all the inspirations for the exercise. Whether you pull quotes, obviously that should be a citation, but even if this is an exercise that you learned in your own training or something that you lifted from a colleague, you should make a point to cite and acknowledge that in the lesson plan that you submit to AATE. The last component that I like to encourage, but it's not totally necessary, is suggested reading. So if your exercise perhaps relates to Theater of the Oppressed, you could cite Games for Actors and Non-Actors as suggested reading. Or if there's an essay that you would encourage folks to check out, or a book of exercises, that would be the place to encourage those. Now, there's some do's and don'ts of lesson plan submissions that I want to emphasize. The first do is something that we see often where folks don't write incomplete sentences, especially for those steps. We really would love for you to write in full sentences even as you're going through the instructions. That being said, make these sentences short and clear. If you want folks to use them in their own classroom, they'll need to be able to read them quickly. And then provide scripted suggestions or lines of instruction to say to students. Sometimes that's honestly the best way of representing your thought and the way you prefer for the lesson to be disseminated to the students. So, quotation mark, okay, students, today we're going to explore how we express emotions with our bodies, end quote. That's helpful to folks reading a lesson plan. Obviously, on the don't section, the antithesis of writing incomplete sentences is don't write incomplete sentences, right? It's important for it not to be haphazard. Please don't create any unconventional formatting unless approved by the editor. Sometimes people will send in weirdly formatted files that are difficult for us to transition or even edit. And of course, don't plagiarize exercises from other practitioners without giving them credit. And the reason why I really have to emphasize this is because it does happen. We are in a field that is naturally about apprentice relationships, and we learn a lot of the things that we imbue to our students from our own teachers. But it's important that we track that chain, especially when we're publishing our work. Now, here's a new category that we're excited to introduce to Incite-Insight, which is photo essays. And this can be a series of images that capture a specific moment of theater and education. The structure of this is as follows. We're thinking 6 to 18 photos would be helpful, and make sure all the photos are high-resolution images. Write 2 to 3 sentence captions for each photo submitted, and ensure that any students or participants featured in the photos have expressed permission to have their likenesses be used and circulated. An example of something you might want to do, an episode that might be applicable to a photo essay structure, is if you are doing an applied theater process or a devised process with students where the emphasis is more on process than product, capturing a moment where the students are investigating something or creating something and categorizing that devising process in a clear approach would be a great way to express visually through this photo essay structure. Now, here's another category, interviews, and I highly recommend this for new writers. If you don't have a lot of experience being published or writing in reflective practice, interviews are a fabulous place to start, not only because you sort of practice writing in a very safe way, but it also encourages you to make connections within the field. So this is a written dialogue transcribed from an in-person meeting phone call, or email. Now, some publications are really persnickety about how to do interviews. For example, at Backstage, we don't do interviews via email. We like to do them in person or over the phone. That's just an editorial preference. For Incite-Insight, however, I actually encourage emails, and we'll get into that a little more. So the interview structure, 1,500 words in length. And we encourage you to reference our style guide, which I'll talk about in a second, to make sure that you understand how to edit for conciseness and clarity. It's highly recommended that the interviewer audio record the interview and transcribe later. If it is in person or over the phone, please make sure that you check in with the subject to let them know that you will be recording the interview for your own note-taking sake. But I highly recommend this. Even if you are a fast writer and have a good shorthand, it's critical that you get folks' words and contexts exactly right. So just let them know that you're going to audio record, and I would recommend doing that. Interviews should be organized using this structure. There should be an introduction, usually 1 to 3 paragraphs. Who is this person? What is your relationship to them? Why are they worth interviewing? And where is this interview going to go? Sometimes it's also helpful too to paint a picture for us. Where are you interviewing this person? I did an interview with the performance artist Kathy Randalls, and we did 2 interviews in 2 different churches. She does work that oftentimes intersects with the religion. So a church felt like a good place to reflect. And it was helpful for me to paint that picture for the reader and help give the context of what was maybe motivating Kathy's thoughts. So that is encouraged if you do an interview. So this is where it gets a little tricky. I have an example next. So I'm going to jump to that example really quickly, but here's the structure. So you should offer the first question, and your full name should be spelled out, followed by a colon. Then the full question should be in bold. First answer has the interviewer's full name spelled out, followed by a colon. And then all the questions after should use initials. So, and all the questions should be in bold. So this is what that looks like. So if Mary Doe is the writer conducting the interview, it would look like this. Full name, Mary Doe, colon, all in bold, no quotation marks. When did you first start this work? And Mary Doe is interviewing John Doe. John Doe responds 18 years ago. So notice that this is the first question, first answer. So we use the full name, no bold, no quotation marks. From there, every question is going to be in bold and just use the writer's initials, and every answer is going to use the respondent's initials. One thing I recommend as well with interviews is in the introduction, you might want to include a paragraph saying this interview has been edited for clarity and conciseness. It's important that you acknowledge that, particularly if you do a lot of editing, just to respect your subject, and you don't want them reading it being like, hey, this is not how the conversation went down exactly. You want folks to know that it's not an exact transcript, but this is an edited expression, and you are sculpting this experience that you had with a specific point in mind for the reader. The last section, or excuse me, the last category that one can submit to Incite-Insight in is an opinion or editorial. So this is an editorialized commentary on a matter that relates to theater and education. This is the preferred structure, 500 words max. So this is on the shorter end. And it should be short, clear, concise sentences. A clear argument should be necessary. And arguments should be backed up by convincing evidence. I'll give you an example from the pre-K to 8 network meeting at the Summers Conference in New York. Some of the members stated that they felt like there just wasn't enough quality recordings of professional performances that could relate to the age demographic of pre-K through 8. So one thing we've been working on is an op-ed to Netflix, PBS, HBO Go maybe, making the case that there is a lack of quality professional recordings of TYA performances, and they should take these companies should take the initiative in doing that. So in order to do that, and what we're doing right now is we're collecting evidence saying, we have these teachers who only have access to these resources when it comes to showing students professional recordings. We have folks who are in rural areas who don't have access to professional TYA theaters like Children's Theater Minneapolis and Seattle and so on. So that's just an example of an op-ed, and that's one that we're working on currently. And the op-ed should encourage positive and productive action. It's not simply a complaint or a call out, but it is a call to action or a proposal for how to rectify whatever situation one might be objecting to or concerned about. It's also worth noting that Incite-Insight does not publish personal attacks. So that's, while there are certainly mediums and platforms to do so, and I'm not saying that there are situations or there are not situations where folks should be called out, particularly people in power, Incite-Insight just isn't the appropriate platform for that. We are aiming to encourage the field in a positive and productive way through different means. Now, with all that being said, let's talk about photos. If you're considering submitting to Incite-Insight in any one of the categories that were just outlined, we highly encourage you to accompany your piece with photos or an image. So a few points on that. The writer should have permission to publish the photo and own it. The photograph should be in high res. Writers should submit a caption with the photo as well. So if you provide a photo of your class doing an exercise that you want to accompany your lesson plan, let's say, you should also provide a caption that explains what's happening in that photo and how it relates to the lesson plan. The writer should submit a photographer credit. So if it was a teacher's assistant, let's say, that took that photo, that person should be credited. And finally, it is the writer's responsibility to ensure that all participants featured in the photo have agreed to have their pictures taken and published. Obviously, if this involves a minor, then you need to check with your institutional administration to see if the family has signed a release for their likeness to be used in such a situation. It might be good, of course, to get in touch with the family as well. Pictures of students should be given approval by the institution which the students attend. That's critically important for a variety of serious reasons, and we know that practitioners understand those reasons. But it's important before any photo is shared of a student, particularly a minor, that you make sure that all of your I's are dotted and T's are crossed institutionally. Further, every writer needs a bio. So when you submit a piece to Incite-Insight, you should provide a bio that's 2 to 3 sentences. Simplicity is key. Here's an example of a bio that would be great for an Incite-Insight submission. Eve Jones is Director of Theater Arts, typo, at Flower High School. That should be a director by trade. Eve has worked with the Atlanta Theater Project. Her writing has appeared in the book Teaching Theater. Very concise. It's not too long. Sometimes folks will submit multi-paragraphed bios, and Incite-Insight simply is not the place for that. With moving to the Facebook platform, engagement is key as a way to encourage dialogue with the readers. So every article ends with this encouragement. Now it's your turn. What do you think? Comment, react, share. Please, though, keep your responses mature and professional. So we encourage writers to engage with the comments and follow up. If a reader responds and has a question or a response, we do want the writers to reply to those and engage and encourage that conversation. Writers are also responsible for circulating their piece to the communities represented. So recently we published a piece about the NYU Verbatim Lab, and we let those folks know, hey, we have this thing published, can you help us get the word out? And they were able to include it in their e-blast and on their Facebook page and social media handles. So that's the writer's responsibility to make sure that the word gets out. Now, let's talk about style. I mentioned earlier that we have a style guide, and the way that and the reason why we have one is because we want Incite-Insight to be accessible and relevant to a wide range of readers. AATE provides the Youth Theater Journal, which is an academic journal, and that demands a certain sort of style for peer review. Incite-Insight, while relating to academic themes, is not an academic publication per se. So we want our structures to be really clear, and we want our language to be simple and easy to understand. So we have this style guide. The style guide can be accessed if you go to AATE's Facebook page and go to the Write With Us article. It is a public link and can be accessed there. I will also send this out to all of you via email once this presentation is concluded. So you'll be able to access Style Guide. It's over like 26 pages, and it has a lot of recommendations on style for writing with Incite-Insight. So this is the first time that we've had a style guide, and essentially it's like a resource. It's an appendix, let's say, for understanding how to spell certain words or certain preferences when it comes to punctuation and approach. And this guide is accessible to anyone who wishes to access it. You don't have to be an approved writer to look at our style guide. It's out in the open for anyone to look at. So here are some of the more essential tips on style from the style guide that I want to emphasize. Keep everything in one font when you submit to Incite-Insight. We spell theater with R-E, not E-R. That's really hard for me. I personally spell theater with an E-R at the end, and a few of the other publications that I work for have that preference. This is not the case for Incite-Insight or AATE. Do not provide a double space after periods. Some folks have been trained to do this, and it's perfectly fine for some resources, but for us, we don't want that. So we want something that looks like this. This is a sentence, period, space. This is a second sentence. You don't want to do that double space after the period. For organizations with abbreviations, on the first mention, you want to write the first name and then put the initials of the acronym in parentheses after. So if you mention the American Alliance for Continuing Education, you will write the full name in the first time you mention it and then put it in parentheses AATE. From there on, it's AATE. Same thing goes with YTJ or TCG, so on and so forth. And we ask our writers to please be mindful and consistent with tense. While some of the stipulations for different categories have a preference for tense, for example, in the case study, we want present tense, we can be loose with tense. All we ask is for a consistency. So if you're in your reflection, if you want to use past tense, that would be encouraged. But you want to make sure as you're editing before you submit that you make sure that your tenses are totally coordinated and consistent. Now, let's talk about tips on documenting your process in practice. The first that I encourage you to do is save and file artifacts. Be an archivist of your work. Hold on to lesson plans, student evaluations, and outlines. One thing I do, for example, is I save every playbill of every show that I go to, and I've done this ever since I was in high school. It might seem a little unhealthy to do that, but I can tell you that it has been invaluable for me in my writing practice because I can reference shows that I've seen or artists whose work I've witnessed. And so that's just one example, that artifacts are a good thing. Document your insights immediately or you will forget them. Some tips for doing that. Send an email to yourself. If you have an email app on your phone and something occurs to you, just quickly open up your email app, send an email to yourself, and that way it's saved there. If you use Google Docs, download the app on your phone and have a running document where you can record your observations and insights. One other thing I encourage you to do, and it's pretty old school, but if you use a paper planner as a way to record trends and observations, even if it's just going through your day and just identifying the topic of every lesson that you approached, then when you're ready to write something, there's something about just flipping through the pages and seeing where the trends are that I find to be a bit easier to do than in Google Calendar or other electronic calendar applications. I encourage you to record and collect materials. So hold on to materials that testify to your process and be engaged in collecting ways that just show what's going on. So take photos. Of course, do this in a responsible way. And like I mentioned before, make sure you have appropriate institutional approval to take photos of students or the intellectual property that the students create. But it's really essential that we record and take a moment to capture the work that's happening in our rooms, in our classrooms. Get testimonials. So quotes are always very helpful to include, and they help keep you honest as a writer, especially when you're reflecting on your own practice. So consider collecting quotes via email. I mentioned this earlier that I prefer email for interviews when it comes to Incite-Insight. That way you have the responses in writing, so you don't have to take all the time to transcribe the audio recording of your interview. And you allow the subject to edit their own response and really think through every word that they use so that when they send that email to you, you know that they feel confident with the answer that they provide. And consider even engaging subjects in the editing process of your piece before you submit it to Incite-Insight. So if you are writing a reflection that incorporates a quote from a principal or a student or a parent, invite them to read your reflection before you submit it. Not just even review their quote, but send them the whole file and say, would you mind looking through this? Do you feel like anything was taken out of context? Is there anything you want to add? Are you unhappy with your quote? Would you like to provide a new one, etc.? It's really important that if folks are being used, that their experiences are being used, that they feel comfortable with that in every way possible. Journalistically speaking, that's not necessarily the practice. I wouldn't do that for necessarily American theater or backstage. But for Incite-Insight, we want to make sure that any community member engaged is fully consenting to the way they are represented. So here are some tips for analyzing your process and your practice. So don't use reflective practice as a way to market yourself. Unfortunately, I see this sometimes, where people use Incite-Insight as a way to promote a book that they have coming out, or they use it to promote their studio, or what have you. Incite-Insight should be a place for vulnerable reflection. I think vulnerable reflection is where the meat is. So be open and honest and upfront with critiques of your own practice. Emphasize your grows along with your grows. Emphasize the grows along with the glows. There it is. Remember, you should just embrace that vulnerability in the same way that we encourage our students when acting to embrace their vulnerability, so should the writer. Understand that your writing, and this is an essential point, understand that your writing or your submission with Incite-Insight is an intervention with the field. I want to repeat that your writing is an intervention. So what do I mean by that? When you submit something for publication, this should be a moment to clarify or change the course of the way we think about something in the field of theater and education. And I think that mindset, that approach, when you are considering what to write, helps make sure that what you're writing is relevant, essential, and packed with info for the reader, and packed with relevance for the reader as well. So let's talk about some tips on structure at a macro level. And ways, if you want to write something, if you've noticed a trend in your planner, if you have a really compelling lesson that you think is worth sharing with the field, here are some big tips that expand beyond whatever category you want to submit to Incite-Insight that might help you get started. The first is one that you might be aware of. This is rather common. It's the inverted pyramid. So the idea that you should start your writing with the most essential information that the audience needs to know. And then from there, you can get into the particulars. But open up with the big idea. Why is this relevant? What am I talking about? And how does this relate to your work? And then once you've established that in your opening few paragraphs, from there on all the way to the end, you can get much more specific and detailed. Here's another approach to analysis that I find particularly helpful. So you'll provide your intro thesis, which is your claim or your intervention, like I said earlier, and then you'll provide a map of how you're going to make the point that this is indeed a relevant intervention with the field, or an offering, right? Then dig into the field situation a little bit, just to prove that you have made you've made the determination that this is indeed an intervention because you've done your due diligence and have seen that no one else has covered this topic, or you've done some homework to see that your experience is indeed truly unique and your voice is essential to expanding this topic. And this is also an opportunity to assess trends that are happening in the field that could make your point more relevant. Then you dig into the body. So this is going into the particulars. This is sort of arbitrary, but 3 at the least points to help bolster your claim of relevance would be helpful. And then the conclusion. Now, there's one mistake that folks often make. The conclusion is not a recap of everything that you discussed, But instead, the conclusion should be the visionary look ahead. Where are you going? What are you doing with this? And what's the next step? And indeed, I think it's sort of a passing of the torch to the next person who wants to write and respond in dialogue with the piece that you submitted. So in this last section, I want to just talk a little bit about the editing process. It's important that before you submit that you self-edit. Now, here are some tips for editing before you submit a piece. Always aim for clear, simple sentences. We said that earlier, and I want to reiterate that, particularly for Incite-Insight. In order to promote accessibility, it's key that the language used and the syntax is pretty straightforward. Read your piece out loud. I do this with everything that I submit, and I'm always shocked by mistakes that I had made and that I probably would not have found if I didn't read it out loud and listen to my own work. Read your piece in different presentations. So what do I mean by that? Pull it up on your phone, read it on a tiny screen, print it out, read it on paper. It's interesting how different ways of looking at your piece can reveal certain mistakes or things you need to add. Here are some tips for being edited. Don't be precious with your writing. Like we tell actors, take the note. Editors are trying to enhance the messaging of your writing, not trying to ruin your voice. And once you submit your piece, it's important to acknowledge that your piece is now out of your head and into the public realm. It's now being shared in a collaborative process. So it's important that you open yourself up to that it's no longer something precious to you, but this is now a working piece with multiple folks involved. And I want to really emphasize this part. Writing can always be enhanced with very simple adjustments. This means maybe just a word needs to be added or a sentence needs to be taken out. Sometimes when we get critical feedback, it feels like, oh gosh, I have to burn the whole house down. That's not the case in my opinion. I've never seen a piece of writing that needed to be reworked or demolished totally. Usually, it's just adding in a word somewhere, and then it's like, oh, that makes much more sense. I think the piece is stronger now. I want to touch on how to utilize your writing. So you can use your writing once you submit and it's circulated as a tool to advocate for your work with administration, parents, and students. You can include your writing in grant applications, or you can even lift pieces of your writing when you are applying for other things, even if you don't submit the full article as an appendix to, or as an amendment to a grant application. You can use these sentences that you've already constructed and have gone through an editing process, knowing that they're sound, knowing that the punctuation is correct, the grammar is correct, etc. And you should see your writing as a connection to the field. Use your piece to inspire and forge connections with other like-minded, oops, that's a typo, it says like-minded or divergent thinkers. And encourage your community to write and reflect as well, particularly your students. If you're engaging in the practice of reflection, I think it's also helpful to get students engaging in a similar habit. A student's reflection on their experience as a participant in a lesson can be particularly helpful to your work as the teacher. So I want to conclude with this thought before I open it up for questions. Jim O'Quinn, who's the founding editor of American Theater, once advised me that the theatrical experience is incomplete until a piece of writing responds to the performance, and thus the post-performance dialogue is instigated and guided or inspired by the writer's words. And I think the same can be said for the teaching experience. Writing and reflecting is the next step in completing the instructional experience, not only for the student, but the teacher as well. So I encourage you to think about that as you move through your own practice as an educator or scholar in the intersection of theater and education, and create this habit of writing reflection on your work and then sharing that reflection with the field at large as the next step of where that lesson needs to go or where the experience of that lesson should land. All right, I know I did a lot of really fast talking, and I'm so sorry that you had to be subjected to that, but I wanted to make sure that we got through all of it, and I wanted to make sure that we had time for questions, which we have about 6 minutes for. So at this time, what I would encourage is, if you can, submit questions in the chat box. If for some reason the chat box isn't showing up, or if it's easier to express your question verbally, it's totally fine to unmute yourself and offer that as well. So the time is now yours, and I'm anxious to see if there's any feedback or inquiry.
Alex, while you were talking, one of our participants was sending some messages that you might want to share out.
Oh, thank you so much. I can see this now. Are you from Laura?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to start with Laura's question. So Laura asked, what do you need in a pitch? In a pitch, for example, an interview. So in a pitch, it's really important that you go into the details about your approach, how you plan to do it, and also what the angle is. It's not enough just to say, I want to interview, I'll use Kathy Randalls again. I want to interview Kathy Randalls because she's interesting. Instead, in the pitch, you should spell out exactly for the editor why this is essential for the readers of the publication. So taking the Kathy Randalls example again. Kathy Randalls has just stopped her public work and is only working with students in a Louisiana prison. That's a shift that has just happened, and I want to share what that shift means with our readers. So that's something that's very specific that the editor can then really go with. I think as a general rule, and I don't want to throw myself or the Incite-Insight team under the bus, I think this is something very generally, editors are incredibly lazy. And so the more work and specifics and particulars that the writer can offer at the offset, the easier it becomes for the editor to greenlight a certain assignment. So I hope that that's helpful, and let me know if there is any clarification I can provide into that. Are there any other questions? While folks are ruminating, I want to make sure that you have my email address. So if you are interested in contributing or even editing with Incite-Insight, shoot me an email. I'm at alex@aate.com. You'll also get my email because I'm going to send you an email once we log off. And you can reach out to me there. In that email, I'll include the style guide. Oh, I'm seeing another question here. What if we are unsure who created an activity or game we used regularly? How should we cite that resource if it's a game or a warm-up we've used for years? That's a great question. So I think if it's, so as we all know, some of these games feel like they've just gone through many different cycles and generations. What I would recommend in that event is to do your best to reflect on where you learned the game and acknowledge that. It doesn't even have to be in a works cited thing. You can do it in text. So you could say, this game I learned at Emerson College when I was an undergrad there. I just used Emerson because that's where I went. Or what have you. And you can just say that in the text. It doesn't have to be a formal works cited section. But just do your best to contextualize where you might have received that information from. And also use your best judgment. If it's something like Zip, Zap, Zop that is sort of very much in the public domain, as it were, then don't feel concerned about using that or a variation of that. But like I said, it might be helpful for you just to throw a bone to where you first learned Zip, Zap, Zop, or ways you've seen it used by other practitioners. Are there any other questions? We're at 12:58 Eastern time, so we have about 2 more minutes of our allotted time. All right. I'm going to give last call for questions. Groovy. I want to thank you all so much for taking the time out of your weekend to tune in and engage with this. I really encourage you to submit your writing to Incite-Insight and also help to share the word. If you have students who you want to encourage their writing practice, or if they are great writers and you want to get their work out there into the field, have them submit. Incite-Insight's a great entree to do that. And I'm seeing another question here, which is really great. Have you ever had pushback from a school about publishing about the school's classwork? That has not been in my experience. Usually, I find that schools are excited to get their work out there. Not for Incite-Insight, but for American Theater. I published a piece about a devised show that happened at Tulane University about a crisis on campus that related to sexual assault, and a theater troupe created a devised experience about that. Even though that the article was covering something that could be perceived as being very critical about the school environment, generally I find that schools are excited to get word out there. Now that might just be at the university level, but what I would recommend for folks working in other institutions or maybe even schools where things might be a little more sensitive, is to cover your bases, communicate with your administrators, or if you feel like that's going to be an issue and you really do think that that your experience should get out to the field at large, just I would recommend using the case study category for that, and hiding the particulars of the specifics that could identify the school or the location, disguising that, but still getting the meat of the experience on paper and out into the field. But like I said, usually, especially with the way academia is going, where it's very publishing-centric, I've found that schools are excited to encourage their employees and faculty members to write, and also to have their school in the mix somehow. Awesome. Thank you all so much. Have a great weekend. Shoot me an email with any questions. And I wish you the best as this semester moves into the next month. All right. Have a great one, everyone. Thank you so much.